Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable: beauty, or more specifically, what people in the medieval period thought beauty looked like, which, as it turns out, often seems less like a timeless ideal and more like a series of very strange, occasionally alarming experiments in personal presentation. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Beauty in the medieval world was not simply a matter of attraction. It was a reflection of health, morality, social rank, and, in many cases, one's ability to endure discomfort with a serene smile. If you think the modern pressure to look perfect is exhausting, imagine living in a time where nearly every visible aspect of your body, skin, hair, teeth, even the size of your forehead, was under constant judgment, and where improving them involved techniques that ranged from the mildly inconvenient to the medically questionable. The ideal medieval woman was pale to the point of translucence, her skin smooth and unblemished like ivory, which might sound lovely until you remember that most people actually worked outdoors and had skin weathered by sun and wind. Paleness was a luxury because it meant you didn't toil in the fields, and so noble women went to absurd lengths to achieve it. One popular method was to apply a paste made from lead and vinegar directly to the face and neck. This might give you the desired porcelain glow for a little while before it inevitably poisoned you, but, worth it for the look. If the lead wasn't to your liking, and let's be honest, it probably wasn't, you could try another approach. Bleeding a small amount of blood from your body to lighten your complexion. Nothing quite says glamorous like a medically induced state of mild anemia. The same ideal extended to men of noble standing. Pale, fine skin was a sign of refinement and intelligence, even if it came at the cost of your actual health. Then there was the matter of the hair. Medieval beauty loved the high forehead, so much so that women sometimes plucked their hairlines back several inches to achieve the desired dome-like look. The hair itself, when visible, was often braided or covered by elaborate headdresses for the nobility, but its color mattered. Blondes, especially the golden sort, were greatly admired. Brunettes were acceptable, but red hair had an unfortunate connection to sin and witchcraft in some circles, which could make life complicated for naturally red-haired women. If you were desperate for lighter locks, you might sit in the sun with a mixture of saffron and onion skins on your hair, hoping it would bleach without burning your scalp too badly. Eyebrows, meanwhile, were considered optional, not in the sense that you could have them shaped, but in the sense that you might just remove them entirely. The smooth, uninterrupted expanse of pale forehead down to the eyelids was thought elegant. The lack of brows, combined with the plucked-back hairline, could give the face an eerily elongated appearance. In paintings from the era, this was, in their eyes, the height of sophistication. In ours, perhaps, the height of uncanny valley. And yet, for all the effort put into facial beauty, the body itself was judged by very different rules. The fashionable female silhouette was modest. Even restrained wide hips were appreciated for their association with fertility, but the waist was to be hidden beneath layers of fabric. The male ideal was equally swaddled. Broad shoulders and a commanding posture mattered more than muscle tone, which, if you think about it, was a convenient standard for a nobility that avoided manual labor at all costs. Teeth were another matter. Few people in the medieval period had what we'd call a good smile, but among the wealthy, efforts were made to keep teeth white or at least mask decay. Herbs like sage were rubbed on the teeth for whitening, and sometimes a paste of honey and burnt rosemary was used to polish them, which sounds both painful and sticky. Perfume, too, was part of the package. Medieval Europe did not have deodorant as we know it, but scented oils, herbs, and flowers could be carried in small pouches or sewn into clothing to mask unpleasant odors. This wasn't just a matter of personal vanity. It was also thought to ward off illness in the days when disease was believed to spread through foul air. Beauty, then, was a full-time occupation for those who could afford it, and a distant, almost mythical concept for those who couldn't. Peasants had neither the time nor the resources to bleach their hair or apply imported powders to their faces, but the ideal still trickled down in simplified form. A farm girl might still cover her hair with a clean kerchief and avoid the sun when possible, even if she could never hope to look like the pale, eyebrowless lady in the manor. It's easy to think of these medieval beauty standards as laughably strange, but they're not so different from ours. We have our own dangerous trends and expensive treatments, our own fixation on unattainable ideals. Perhaps the only difference is that, in 1,000 years, someone might be describing our era's beauty rituals in the same slow, bemused tone, imagining the strange lengths we went to for the sake of looking just right. If you were a medieval noblewoman waking up in the morning, your beauty routine would not begin with coffee or a quick rinse. It would begin with assessment. In the small, dim light of your chamber, you would consider the pallor of your skin, the arrangement of your hair, and whether or not your complexion had suffered overnight from poor air or the wrong bedding. Beauty was not an occasional performance but a daily discipline, and the mirror, when you had one, was not a friend but an unforgiving Judge. Mirrors themselves were rare and imperfect, made of polished metal or small pieces of glass backed with lead. They gave a cloudy reflection, more suggestion than photograph, which perhaps was a blessing when your beauty regimen involved homemade cosmetics of questionable quality. These could include powders made from ground oyster shells for whitening, or rouge created from crushed red plants and minerals. The goal wasn't to look natural in the way we think of it today. It was to project health, wealth, and a certain untouchable refinement, even if your makeup could technically double as masonry filler. Cosmetics for the lips were a tricky matter. A healthy, rosy mouth was admired, but paint it too boldly and you risked whispers about vanity or, worse, loose morals. The safest way to enhance lips was with subtle tints from berries or tinted waxes. Beeswax could be mixed with plant dyes to create a lip balm of sorts, both softening and coloring the lips at once. Men, for their part, rarely painted their faces, but they were not exempt from grooming expectations. Clean nails, neat hair, and the faint scent of expensive spices were marks of breeding. Speaking of scent, bathing was part of beauty in the medieval mind, but not in the way we understand it. Baths were taken less often, partly because of the belief that bathing too frequently could weaken the body. But when they did bathe, the wealthy made it an aromatic affair. Herbs such as rosemary, lavender, and thyme were added to the water, not just for fragrance but for supposed health benefits after the bath. Skin might be rubbed with oils or animal fats to keep it soft in cold, dry weather. Hair care, however, was its own science. Hair was washed less often than the body, and when it was, it might be with soap made from lye and animal fat, or simply with warm water infused with herbs. Combing was an important ritual, not just for detangling but for distributing natural oils from scalp to ends. A lady's comb might be carved from wood, bone, or even ivory, and was considered as personal and intimate as a toothbrush would be to us today. Then there were the lengths people went to in order to maintain beauty during travel or special events. A woman might carry a pomander, a small, often ornate container filled with fragrant herbs or resin, to mask the less charming aromas of medieval streets in winter. She might keep a thin veil across her face to shield her skin from windburn, while in summer she would stay under the shade of a parasol or canopy to preserve her prized pallor. In some courts, beauty was even a form of currency. Certain noblewomen were celebrated across Europe for their looks, painted into portraits and written into poems. In these cases, beauty could influence marriages, politics, and alliances. A well-placed marriage proposal might hinge on a woman's complexion or her ability to maintain her appearance under the unforgiving eye of court society. Men, too, could be praised for striking features, a straight nose, bright eyes, and well-kept beard, but a man's beauty was often framed as evidence of vigor, leadership, or divine favor rather than pure ornament. Jewelry played a role here as well. A necklace or brooch wasn't just decoration. It was a visual signal that one was wealthy enough to own gold, silver, and gems, and refined enough to display them tastefully. Rings could be worn in layers, sometimes to the point where the fingers were barely visible beneath the metal and stones, but this, too, was a balancing act. Too much jewelry could look gaudy and undermine the perception of natural elegance. The right amount suggested someone who had always looked like this, even in sleep, without trying. But perhaps one of the strangest aspects of medieval beauty was the way it was tied to virtue. Pale skin, delicate features, and fine clothing were not just signs of wealth but of moral purity. A woman who looked too robust, tanned, or visibly muscular might be assumed to have spent too much time laboring outdoors. Seen as unladylike in upper circles in literature and art, beauty was often a shorthand for goodness, while ugliness was linked unfairly to vice or corruption. And so, beauty was not just about looking appealing, it was about fitting into a social and moral order, about making your body a visible statement of status and propriety. Even if the methods, plucked hairlines, lead-based powders, and occasional light bloodletting, sound to us like the plot of a particularly grim fairy tale. If you think a modern facial with cucumbers over the eyes is indulgent, medieval beauty treatments would make you reconsider your definition of luxury or sanity. Some were simple enough: a honey mask to soften the skin, or a rinse of rosewater for fragrance and freshness. These you could imagine enjoying on a quiet afternoon without fear of hospitalization. But others? Well, they took the beauty is pain philosophy and treated it more as a binding legal contract. One of the most sought-after looks in certain centuries was a smooth, high forehead. The solution? Pluck out your hairline until it began halfway up your scalp. Women would sit with small tweezers or even heated cloth strips, removing hair bit by bit to create the illusion of an elongated, elegant skull. Sometimes eyebrows were shaved off entirely, leaving the face oddly open, like a blank canvas for the eyes to float. In the middle of this was not a practice reserved for one eccentric court. portraits from England to Italy show the same peculiar, lofty hairline. Skin lightening was another priority. Pale skin was associated with nobility, partly because it suggested you had never done outdoor labor. The recipes for whitening ranged from mildly unpleasant to directly poisonous. Lead-based powders were a favorite among the wealthy. They provided an opaque, ghostly whiteness and could also smooth over blemishes, though at the cost of slowly poisoning the wearer. Mercury compounds made appearances too, promising radiance while steadily ruining the skin. They were applied in thick layers and often sealed with egg whites to create a kind of makeup shell. Freckles, meanwhile, were enemies of ideal beauty. They suggested sun exposure, and thus work freckles were targeted with treatments that sound like pranks invented by bored apothecaries. One popular solution was to dab on a paste of lemon juice mixed with ground alum or vinegar. The acid could, in theory, lighten the spots. In practice, it usually just irritated the skin. Another method involved bathing the face in donkey's milk, which was believed to have clarifying properties. This was not always easy to source unless you happened to live near a very patient donkey owner. Teeth, too, were part of beauty, though dental hygiene was not as advanced as today. Some people sought bright, white smiles by rubbing their teeth with mixtures of crushed sage, salt, and even ground pumice. These were mildly abrasive, which did make teeth appear cleaner, at least until the enamel began to wear down. In some regions, especially Italy, having slightly darkened teeth could actually be a fashion statement, believed to make the lips look redder and more appealing. It's a reminder that beauty standards are never universal, even within the same century. Then there was hair coloring. Medieval women and men both experimented with dyes, though the shades were more limited than a modern salon could offer. A reddish gold tone was highly prized, associated with youth and allure. Henna, saffron, and even mixtures of rhubarb root could be applied to achieve a warm glow. Blonde hair was also fashionable in certain courts and could be encouraged with a concoction of lye and chamomile, left to sit in the sun for hours, an activity as risky for your scalp as it was for your overall comfort. Perfume, while not strictly a cosmetic, was part of the beauty arsenal. Scented oils and pomanders masked the realities of medieval life, from smoky rooms to less than pristine streets. Ambergris, musk and civet, substances collected from whales, deer, and civet cats, were treasured for their lasting scent, though modern noses might find them overpowering. A carefully chosen fragrance could linger for hours, creating an invisible aura of wealth and refinement. Even nails were not ignored, though not painted in the way we do now. They were buffed smooth and sometimes tinted with natural stains like henna in certain regions. Neat, well-kept hands suggested gentility, especially for women whose livelihoods didn't require physical labor. Yet, for all these elaborate measures, medieval beauty was still at the mercy of nature. Illness, poor diet, and age could undo years of careful maintenance. There were no guaranteed fixes, only the hope that diligence, and perhaps a little divine favor, would keep one in society's good graces. A wrinkle here or a blemish there could shift perceptions in ways as subtle and ruthless as court gossip itself. If youth was a fleeting candle in medieval life, then anti-aging treatments were the frantic and often dangerous attempts to keep the wick from burning out entirely. No one had invented the phrase age gracefully yet, and if they had, it would have been met with a raised eyebrow and a pot of dubious ointment, because beauty wasn't just about vanity, it was currency, and losing it could mean losing influence, prospects, even security. One of the more alarming anti-aging methods involved bathing the face in mixtures made from animal organs. Calf's liver, for example, was boiled, mashed into a paste, and applied directly to the skin. It was thought to restore youthfulness by imparting the vitality of the young animal to the wearer. Another favorite was pigeon's blood, which was dabbed lightly onto cheeks for a fresh, lively flush. The effect was immediate, though it also came with the faint metallic scent of regret. Herbs, too, were part of the anti-aging arsenal. Rosemary, sage, and fennel were ground into powders or infused into oils for skin massage. Rosemary, in particular, was celebrated as a memory herb and thought to renew both the face and the mind. Bathhouses sometimes offered infusions of these herbs in warm water, allowing patrons to soak and, in theory, absorb their rejuvenating qualities. Egg-based masks were popular as well. Egg whites, when painted onto the face and left to dry, created an instant skin-tightening sensation. It smoothed lines temporarily, though the stiffness made smiling, or really any facial expression, risky. Yolks, on the other hand, were mixed with honey and applied for moisture. The combination smelled faintly of breakfast but was considered deeply nourishing. Some remedies strayed into the realm of the truly bizarre. Take, for instance, the belief in gold's life-giving properties. Fine gold leaf could be ground into powders and mixed into creams, or even consumed in tiny amounts by those who could afford it. The logic was that gold, being incorruptible, would pass its eternal qualities to the human body. Unfortunately, gold is as stubborn in the stomach as it is in the earth. offering more sparkle to the apothecary's purse than to the user's complexion. In certain courts, exotic ingredients were prized simply for their rarity. Powdered pearls, amber dust, and crushed coral all found their way into beauty potions. These were believed to smooth skin, reduce wrinkles, and enhance one's inner radiance. The science was questionable, but the shimmer of such treatments, both literal and symbolic, was irresistible to the wealthy. There were also rituals to draw out the years from the body. Some involved sweating in heated chambers, while wearing herbal poultices. Others took a more superstitious turn, such as sleeping with certain stones under one's pillow to absorb aging or washing in dew collected at dawn on May Day. This was thought to cleanse away the marks of time and leave the face as fresh as spring itself. Makeup, too, played a role in masking age. Pale powders and rouge were applied more generously as years went on, creating the illusion of smooth, unblemished skin. This had its dangers, especially when the powders contained lead or mercury. Prolonged use could cause discoloration, tremors, or worse, meaning that the pursuit of eternal youth could literally shorten the life it was meant to beautify. Still, for all the potions, pastes, and charms, there was no true escape from the passage of time. Medieval portraits reveal faces lined with care, eyes heavy with experience, and beauty redefined by each stage of life. Perhaps, deep down, people knew their efforts were a losing battle, but in an age when appearance shaped destiny, the temptation to chase youth was simply too strong to resist. Hair in the medieval imagination was never just hair. It was a statement, a symbol, and sometimes a stage prop depending on the century and region. A person's hair could signify purity, wealth, marital status, or even spiritual devotion. And because medieval people rarely did anything in moderation when it came to appearances, hairstyling was often a grand production, especially for those who could afford the time and the hands to fuss over it. For women of higher status, hair was frequently described in poetry as a crown in its own right. Long, flowing locks were seen as the ultimate sign of beauty, but ironically, the more beautiful it was, the less it was shown. Unmarried women could wear their hair loose as a sign of their availability, but once married, it was expected to be covered with veils, wimples, or elaborate headdresses. The irony was that hair, prized as a beauty asset, spent much of its public life hidden from view like an expensive jewel kept in a locked box. Still, under those coverings, considerable effort went into care and presentation. Combs were carved from bone, wood, or ivory, often intricately decorated, making hair grooming almost a ritual. Oils infused with herbs like rosemary or lavender were applied to add shine and a pleasant scent. Essential in an era when soap was precious and bathing was infrequent, hair washing, when it did happen, was often done with mixtures of ash and lye, which could leave hair clean but brittle. So herbal rinses and ointments became important to restore softness. Braiding was a universal favorite, practical, decorative, and endlessly variable. Intricate braids could be coiled around the head, threaded with ribbons, or woven into jeweled nets. Noblewomen sometimes wore styles so elaborate they required assistance from more than one attendant and hours to complete. In certain courts, hair could be padded and arranged into towering shapes, adorned with pearls or tiny metal ornaments that caught the light at feasts and dances. Men's hairstyles were equally deliberate, though rarely as towering. Short to medium-length hair was most common, sometimes curled or shaped to frame the face. Knights returning from campaigns might sport slightly longer, shaggier hair. A rugged look that blended martial masculinity with the faint whiff of romance. Beards came in and out of fashion depending on the region and the ruler's personal taste. One king's clean-shaven face could spark a trend that swept across the nobility within months. Religion, as always, played its part. Monks famously wore the tonsure, shaving the crown of the head while leaving a ring of hair around it, a style that seemed deliberately designed to repel any notions of vanity. Yet even here, the cut was maintained neatly, because neglect could be seen as disrespect to the religious order. Some hairstyles bordered on the theatrical. In the Burgundian court of the 15th century, women adopted the hennin, a tall, conical headdress sometimes over a foot high, from which a veil would cascade. The hair underneath was tightly pulled back and padded to fit the shape. The effect was part fairy tale, part architectural marvel, and entirely impractical in doorways. Meanwhile, in England and France, hair could be plucked from the forehead to create the fashionable high hairline, an early form of cosmetic self-editing. Coloring hair was also practiced, though far less reliably than today. Blonde hair, in particular, was idealized in many cultures. Women might try to lighten their hair with mixtures of saffron, alum, and even stale urine, followed by long hours in the sun to bake the color in. While the results varied wildly, the pursuit of the golden look persisted. Hair, in short, was as much a part of medieval beauty standards as skin, clothing, or jewels. It was a medium of self-expression, bound tightly to the values, rules, and fantasies of the time. And whether hidden beneath silk veils or spilling loose in carefully staged portraits, it remained one of the most carefully guarded treasures a person possessed. If the medieval ideal of hair was elaborate but at least somewhat practical, the ideals for eyebrows and eyelashes veered into stranger territory. Medieval faces were not framed by lush brows or fluttering lashes. In fact, in many parts of Europe, particularly among the nobility, the opposite was true. The most fashionable women of the 14th and 15th centuries aimed for an almost bare, ethereal look, as if the face were a blank canvas for the viewer's imagination. This meant plucking eyebrows into thin, high arches or removing them entirely along with much of the hair at the temples. The goal was to create a high, smooth forehead, which was considered elegant and intelligent. It's worth remembering that beauty ideals then were less about imitating nature and more about sculpting the body into a kind of living art form. The forehead was like a blank wall upon which your social status could be painted, metaphorically speaking, with the tools of plucking, shaving, and patience. Eyelashes, which modern beauty standards treasure, were often viewed as unnecessary distractions in some courts. Women removed them entirely to create a cleaner, uninterrupted line around the eyes. The idea was to draw attention to the shape and clarity of the eyes themselves, unshadowed by the flutter of hair around them. Medieval paintings of fashionable women often show faces that, to modern viewers, look oddly alien, smooth, pale expanses where we expect the definition of brows and lashes. Achieving this look wasn't easy or painless. Small tweezers, made of metal or bone, were used for plucking, and since this was done without the benefit of modern lighting, it could be a slow, tedious process. The wealthy could delegate the task to a maid or attendant, who was expected to work carefully enough to avoid leaving the skin red and irritated, which was a sign of overzealous grooming. Cosmetics, though officially frowned upon in many regions for their associations with vanity or deceit, were still used subtly to enhance or maintain the ideal. Thin, dark lines might be painted where brows had been removed, creating the illusion of shape without the bulk of actual hair. Sometimes soot or powdered charcoal was used for this purpose, applied with a small stick or brush. Of course, not everyone adhered to these trends. Peasants and townsfolk often had neither the time nor the resources to pursue such precise grooming. Their brows and lashes remained more or less as nature intended, but for the elite, the removal of these features was as much a statement of wealth as it was of taste. After all, anyone who could afford to spend hours altering their eyebrows was clearly not burdened by the need to till a field or carry water. Religious commentary occasionally condemned these practices as frivolous or sinful. Moralists warned that altering one's natural features tempted pride and distracted from spiritual duties, yet the allure of the fashionable high forehead and unbroken facial line proved hard to resist. By the end of the medieval period, some of these extreme trends softened, brows returning to more natural shapes as Renaissance ideals took hold. Still, for a few centuries, the perfect medieval face was as much about what was removed as what was displayed. An aesthetic that treated the body less like a given and more like a canvas awaiting careful, sometimes painful, curation. If medieval eyes were framed by absence, the lips were framed by intention. In a world without lipstick counters or Instagram filters, enhancing the mouth required both creativity and, occasionally, a willingness to risk mild poisoning. While many modern beauty ideals emphasize fullness, medieval preferences could shift depending on the region and the century. In some courts, small, delicately shaped lips were prized, as they suggested refinement and modesty, while in others, a healthy flush was considered the mark of vitality. Achieving either effect often involved pigments made from materials you wouldn't willingly ingest today. Crushed red ochre, ground cinnabar, and even vermilion, a mercury-based compound, were used to tint the lips. These substances could be mixed with animal fat, beeswax, or plant oils to create a paste. The result might be a warm, rosy hue or a more dramatic red, depending on the application, but the danger lay in prolonged exposure to the heavy metals. Within, some wearers suffered from cracked lips, tooth loss, or worse, though the connection to their cosmetics was rarely made at the time. Less toxic methods existed for the cautious or the rural. Simply rubbing the lips with beetroot, elderberries, or red wine could provide a temporary stain in colder climates. Pinching or lightly biting the lips before entering a gathering was a quick way to bring color to the surface. Though it faded as quickly as the blood flow did in portraits, the subtler tints often appear as barely their washes of pink, which would have been more realistic than the saturated reds imagined by modern romanticism. Shape mattered as much as color for those seeking a refined look. The goal was symmetry and proportion, attributes often guided by the geometry of the face rather than the lips themselves. Some beauty guides suggested avoiding wide smiles, which were considered unrefined, and instead maintaining a demure, closed-mouth expression. This was partly about modesty and partly practical. Medieval dental care was rudimentary at best, and even the wealthy could have stained or missing teeth. Lip care was not overlooked. Balms made from honey, animal fat, or lanolin kept the skin soft and prevented chapping, which was important in drafty stone halls or windy market squares. Scented oils, infused with rose or lavender, could also be applied for both softness and fragrance, subtly signaling refinement to those close enough to notice. There were also symbolic associations at play. Lips, after all, were not just for beauty. They were instruments of speech, prayer, and courtly love and poetry. A lover's lips might be compared to cherries, coral, or fresh blossoms, their hue implying health and their form suggesting moral or romantic worth. Thus, enhancing them was never purely cosmetic. It carried cultural meaning that could elevate or diminish one's perceived desirability. But for every well-tended pair of lips in a candlelit hall, there were countless more left to nature's whims. Peasants in the fields, merchants in bustling markets, and travelers on the road had neither the time nor the means for tinted pigments or imported oils. Their lips bore the honest marks of weather and work, cracked in winter, sun-darkened in summer, and utterly unfashionable to the aristocratic eye. Skin, in the medieval imagination, was not simply a layer of flesh. It was a social billboard. Its color, texture, and clarity could speak volumes before a single word was exchanged. Pale, unblemished skin was not just considered beautiful. It was proof of status, a visible declaration that you did not labor in the sun, did not toil in fields, and were thus free from the stains of manual work. Achieving and maintaining that paleness, however, could be an exhausting and dangerous process. Aristocratic women, and even some men, relied on a blend of powders and washes to produce the desired effect. Lead carbonate was a common base, ground into a fine dust and applied to the face, neck, and hands. It created an almost ghostly whiteness under candlelight, but it also seeped into the skin, slowly poisoning the wearer. Symptoms could range from headaches and hair loss to severe skin deterioration, which ironically required even more cosmetic layering to conceal. Not everyone resorted to heavy metals. Plant-based lighteners existed too. Water infused with lily petals, cucumber, or lemon was dabbed onto the skin to brighten the complexion. Milk baths, especially those from goats or asses, were believed to soften and whiten the skin. Echoing Roman traditions, honey mixed with ground almonds could be used as a gentle exfoliant, leaving the face smoother and, in theory, more luminous. Freckles and moles were particularly unwelcome to the highborn ideal. Freckles suggested too much sun exposure, and moles were sometimes viewed through the lens of superstition, hinting at bad luck or even moral flaw. Ointments to fade such marks might include vinegar, sour milk, or a paste made from parsley and powdered chalk. The effectiveness was questionable, but the effort underscored how deeply tied appearance was to social perception. Skin also needed to be smooth. Wrinkles, dryness, or roughness suggested aging or neglect. Herbal oils, such as those pressed from olive or walnut, were massaged into the skin not only for softness but also for scent. Rosewater was a favored finishing touch, leaving a faint floral aroma that lingered in the air when one passed by, a subtle way of marking refinement without words. Of course, in rural villages and market towns, skin told a different story. Sun-darkened faces, wind-burned cheeks, and calloused hands were common. Not shameful among working communities, they reflected labor, resilience, and the practical indifference to aristocratic beauty codes. Soap, when available, was for cleaning, not for perfecting, and often smelled more of lye and animal fat than roses. What's striking is how much of medieval skincare, dangerous as it could be, was driven by symbolism. Pale skin was not inherently healthier. It was simply rarer among those in power, and rarity is a potent form of beauty currency. The paler you appeared, the further removed you seemed from physical hardship. Eyebrows in the medieval world were not left to grow freely. They were shaped, altered, and in some cases entirely removed to fit shifting ideals of beauty. The high forehead, for example, was a prized feature in many parts of Europe during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. To achieve it, women sometimes shaved or plucked their eyebrows and even the front hairline, creating an expanse of pale skin above the eyes that to our modern gaze might look slightly alien, but to theirs radiated elegance and intellect. This forehead obsession was rooted partly in symbolism. The forehead was thought to be the seat of wisdom and nobility. The larger it appeared, the more refined the person seemed. Portraits of noble women often emphasized this vast, unbroken space. With brows so faint they're nearly invisible, the result was a serene, doll-like face where the eyes seemed to float in an ocean of white skin. When eyebrows were kept, they were expected to be thin and finely shaped. Overgrown brows hinted at wildness. Poor grooming or low-status women might use small knives, tweezers, or pumice stones to thin the line. Men, too, paid attention to their brows, though more subtly. They were trimmed for neatness rather than beauty. Color also played a role. Medieval cosmetics recipes sometimes included ways to darken or even gild the brows for special occasions. A mix of soot, crushed berries, or powdered charcoal could be applied with a small brush, much like an early eyebrow pencil for festivals or pageants. There are records of brows being painted in gold or tinted with saffron for a warm glow. These embellishments were rare in daily life, but they reveal how brows could be a canvas for artistry as much as practicality. The eyes themselves carried their own demands. Large, Bright eyes were often praised in poetry and song, described as like stars or like the clear blue of a mountain spring. To enhance them, women might rim the lashes with coal or soot, a technique inherited from ancient traditions. Not only did it make the eyes stand out, but it was believed to protect against the glare of sunlight or even ward off illness. Some recipes advised using powdered antimony for this purpose, effective in deepening. The black, but like lead, potentially toxic eye color, of course, couldn't be changed, but it was imbued with meaning. Brown eyes could be warm and trustworthy, blue eyes innocent and divine, green eyes rare and enchanting, though sometimes tinged with suspicion. In folk tales, poets made much of these associations, weaving them into courtly love stories that gave beauty a layer of romance and danger. Gazes mattered as much as the eyes themselves. A steady, calm look conveyed dignity, while darting or overly bold stares could be read as improper for women. The demure glance, slightly lowered lids, eyes upturned only in brief moments, was considered particularly attractive and virtuous. And yet, while nobles perfected their brows and softened their gazes, most peasants had little time for such refinements. A brow was there to keep sweat out of the eyes during work in the fields, and a gaze was a practical tool, scanning for weather changes or livestock straying beyond fences. Beauty ideals were, as always, a luxury of those who could afford them. Lips in the medieval imagination were symbols of vitality, temptation, and refinement. Their shape, color, and even the way they moved were carefully judged by those inclined to notice such things. Poets praised rosebud lips or mouths red as coral, linking them to freshness, youth, and love. In paintings and illuminated manuscripts, noble women's lips are often depicted small and delicately curved, a slight smile suggesting both charm and restraint. Never wide, never loud, because beauty was as much about control as appearance. The preferred shade for lips was a natural but vivid red, as though kissed by the cold of an early morning or warmed by the flush of excitement. To achieve this, medieval women sometimes resorted to homemade cosmetics. Crushed berries, particularly strawberries or elderberries, could be dabbed on for temporary color. Another trick involved applying a thin layer of beeswax to lock in moisture, giving the lips a subtle shine. More adventurous recipes called for mixing red ochre with animal fat to create a longer-lasting tint, effective, though with a distinct earthy taste. Lip shape was also a point of quiet focus. A small, heart-shaped mouth was seen as youthful and innocent, while fuller lips hinted at sensuality in courtly settings. Both could be admired, but each carried its own social undertones. In some contexts, overly full lips might be linked to immodesty, especially for women, while thin lips could suggest austerity and self-control. Men, though less scrutinized, were often praised for firm, well-shaped mouths, symbols of decisiveness and command. Teeth, on the other hand, were trickier. Medieval Europe had no fluoride, no orthodontics, and very little sugar compared to today, which meant cavities were less common, but tooth wear and loss were inevitable. Cleanliness varied wildly. Some noble households used toothpicks made of silver or quills, and there are records of mouthwashes made from wine mixed with herbs like sage or rosemary. These could freshen breath, but did little for underlying decay. White, even teeth were admired but rare, and thus a mark of youth rather than lifelong grooming. In many love poems, a lover's teeth are compared to pearls, a poetic ideal that reality seldom matched. Peasants, whose diets were coarse and heavy on bread ground with stone-milled flour, often wore down their teeth. By middle age, the gritty residue left in bread from grinding stones acted like sandpaper over the years. There were also curious cosmetic attempts at dental enhancement. Some recipes suggest rubbing teeth with powdered pumice or burnt rosemary to whiten them, a practice that may have worked in the short term but also stripped enamel. In Italy, a more extreme beauty trick involved filing teeth into even shapes, a procedure as painful as it sounds and one that risked infection. Breath, too, mattered more than one might expect. A foul odor could undermine even the most perfect smile. Remedies included chewing cloves, parsley, or fennel seeds before social gatherings. In noble courts, where close conversation and whispered intrigues were part of daily life, fresh breath was as much a part of grooming as clean clothes. All this focus on lips and teeth wasn't purely about appearance. It was about signaling health, youth, and, in the case of the upper classes, the leisure to tend to such details. A beautiful mouth could be the centerpiece of a face, the place where words, songs, and smiles emerged, and thus it was tended with the same care as any precious ornament. Hair in the medieval imagination was far more than a natural covering. It was a public signal of status, morality, and desirability. The shade of one's hair could carry connotations so deeply ingrained in the culture that a single color might inspire entire stories. Golden hair, for instance, was associated with purity, nobility, and divine favor. Poets compared it to sunlight, ripened wheat, and threads of spun gold in illuminated manuscripts. The Virgin Mary was sometimes shown with golden hair, though in reality such coloring was uncommon in most of Europe. Achieving such a hue, however, was not always a matter of genetics. Medieval people, especially noble women, were not above coaxing nature along in pursuit of the ideal bleaching concoctions made from saffron, alum, and even pigeon droppings were used, often applied while sitting in the sun with hair fanned out under fine veils. The process could take hours, and the results varied from gentle honey tones to brassy yellows. Sometimes the hair was lightened so aggressively it became brittle, snapping, like straw, but the allure of golden strands outweighed the damage. Red hair occupied a stranger place in the beauty hierarchy in certain regions, especially in Celtic lands. It could be celebrated as fiery, spirited, and rare, but in other contexts, particularly in medieval Christian symbolism, it was associated with danger, deceit, or even witchcraft. This duality made red hair an object of fascination. It could draw admiration and suspicion in equal measure. Women with red hair might be painted as exotic temptresses in court poetry, but in moralizing sermons, they might be cast as dangerously alluring. Dark hair, especially deep brown or black, was more common and thus less remarked upon in literature. Yet it could be romanticized as mysterious, serious, or wise for peasants. It was simply the norm, a practical inheritance of genetics rather than a cultivated fashion statement among the nobility. However, dark hair could still carry prestige when paired with pale skin, creating a striking visual contrast favored by painters and poets alike. Dyeing hair darker was less common than lightening it, but it did happen. Recipes for dark dyes included walnut hulls, boiled rosemary, and a mixture of soot and vinegar. These methods gave a temporary deepening of tone but were messy and prone to streaking. Some people also used henna imported through trade routes from the Middle East, which could create shades ranging from warm auburn to deep copper. Symbolically, hair color often intersected with ideas of personality. Golden-haired women were imagined as gentle and virtuous, brunettes as wise and steadfast, redheads as passionate and unpredictable. Whether or not these associations were true mattered less than the fact that they were believed, and that belief shaped how people judged each other's beauty. Men's hair color was also part of the conversation, though not with the same intensity. Blonde hair in men could suggest youth and chivalry. Dark hair, authority and steadiness. Red hair in men could carry either the mark of a fiery temperament or a hint of untrustworthiness. Knights in romances were often painted with golden locks, even if the reality under their helmets was far less flattering. Length, in the medieval mind, was not a casual matter. When it came to hair, it was an open declaration of who you were and where you stood in the invisible hierarchy that ran through every village, city, and court. For women, especially those of noble rank, long hair was a prized possession, an unspoken proof of youth, vitality, and femininity. In art, the flowing tresses of a lady could cascade in impossible waves, a symbol as potent as any jewel or fine gown. But in reality, this hair was rarely displayed without restraint. In much of medieval Europe, modesty dictated that a married woman should cover her hair entirely, sometimes with a wimple, veil, or intricately wrapped linen bands. Loose hair was the domain of maidens, brides on their wedding day, or women in moments of private intimacy. To appear in public with one's hair unbound could be interpreted as flirtatious, or worse, indecent. The rules were not entirely rigid. There were festivals, processions, and religious pageants where women might wear their hair uncovered, sometimes adorned with ribbons, beads, or flowers. In certain regions, especially in Italy, elaborate braiding was an art form unto itself. Hair could be plaited, looped, and wound into intricate shapes, often to support a jeweled net or decorative headdress. These hairstyles were both protective and performative, signaling refinement while keeping the hair in place during long social gatherings. For peasants, practicality overrode much of this fashion. Women often kept their hair plaited simply to keep it out of their way while working. Covering it with a simple coif or kerchief protected it from dust, lice, and the grime of daily labor. There was still a sense of pride in healthy, well-kept hair, but it was measured against the constant demands of survival rather than courtly display. Men's hair length shifted with fashion and with the shifting ideals of masculinity. In the early medieval period, shoulder length or longer hair was common among noblemen, a sign of vigor and lineage. Some rulers, like the Merovingian kings, considered long hair a mark of royal authority. Cutting it could be seen as a symbolic dethronement. By the later Middle Ages, however, men's hair tended to grow shorter, especially among knights and soldiers, for the practical reason that long hair and helmets made for an irritating combination. The church also had opinions. Monks were famously tonsured, shaven at the crown. As a mark of humility and renunciation, priests and clerics might keep their hair short to distinguish themselves from the laity. Yet in courtly poetry, a knight's locks might still be described in loving detail, shining in the torchlight of a great hall, even if such descriptions owed more to romantic imagination than battlefield reality. In times of political or religious tension, hair length could even become a dividing line. Sumptuary laws in some cities specified who could wear certain hairstyles, reinforcing the idea that beauty and grooming were privileges tied to class and not freely available to everyone. If medieval hair carried meaning, The head coverings that crowned it could shout entire essays about a person without a single word spoken. These were not just functional pieces meant to keep out the chill or shield from the sun. Though they certainly did that, they were coded messages about age, rank, wealth, and even piety. For married women, a covered head was the standard, but how it was covered varied wildly across regions and centuries. The wimple, for example, wrapped snugly around the neck and chin, leaving only the face visible. In the 12th and 13th centuries, it was a hallmark of modesty and respectability for the upper classes in France and England and Italy. By contrast, women might wear a sheer veil draped loosely over coiled braids, allowing a tantalizing suggestion of the hair beneath. By the 14th and 15th centuries, headgear had reached architectural levels of ambition. The hennin, the tall, conical hat often caricatured in fairy tales, was a genuine fashion. Though usually shorter than the absurd spikes we imagine, its tip might be veiled in fine silk. Trailing almost to the ground, these towering hats were popular among noblewomen in Burgundy and France, not just for their drama, but because they physically elevated the wearer above the crowd, making them quite literally stand. Accessories were not limited to fabric and shape. Pins, combs, and jeweled circlets could transform a simple veil into an opulent display. Gold filigree, pearls, and semi-precious stones might be sewn into the edges of a headdress, turning it into a statement of both taste and financial muscle. Even something as humble as a ribbon could signal class if it was dyed with expensive imported pigments. For peasant women, the story was plainer. Linen kerchiefs or wool caps were more common, chosen for durability over style. That doesn't mean beauty was absent. On feast days, even the humblest woman might add a bright strip of cloth or embroider her cap with simple patterns, but practicality was the reigning principle. Men, too, participated in the headwear game. Though their hats were generally smaller and less gravity-defying, they could still be elaborate. A 15th-century nobleman might sport a chaperon, a hat that began life as a hood but evolved into a folded, draped contraption that could look quite jaunty or, depending on the wearer's taste, absurd. The wide-brimmed felt hats of travelers, the fur-lined caps of wealthy merchants, or the metal-studded helmets of soldiers all doubled as indicators of social role and means. Even religious symbolism bled into fashion. Certain colors, like deep blue, often linked to the Virgin Mary, might be favored by women who wanted to project moral purity. Others might choose white for innocence, or red for power and passion in courts. These choices were rarely random. Next, we'll turn our attention to something that was far less conspicuous but no less telling: skin, and the medieval obsession with keeping it pale, smooth, and untouched by the sun. In the medieval imagination, pale skin was not merely a matter of personal taste. It was a declaration of status, the kind of message you couldn't help but send even if you never uttered a word about your place in society. To be pale meant, quite simply, that you did not labor outdoors, you weren't toiling in fields or bending over vats in a tannery. The sun was something you experienced from behind a window, not from the wrong end of a plow. For noblewomen, this ideal was pursued with almost religious devotion. Some women went so far as to avoid walking outdoors entirely during the brightest hours, preferring to take air in shaded courtyards or under parasols when necessity forced them into the sun. They might wear veils or wide hats that cast the face in shadow. Cosmetic aids were plentiful. If often dangerous, chalk powder, lead-based creams, and ground alabaster were all applied to lighten the complexion. Some recipes even called for vinegar washes, which had the double effect of smoothing the skin and making it inhospitable to the sun's darkening touch. Naturally, these treatments could also poison you slowly over time, but beauty standards have rarely been dissuaded by minor inconveniences like lead absorption. Pale skin wasn't just for women. Noblemen, too, took pride in an unweathered face. Portraits of courtly men often show smooth, almost delicate features. No trace of the rugged suntan we might associate with masculinity today. This was the age when refinement meant removing yourself from the physical realities of the world, not advertising your ability to conquer them. Yet pale skin had another layer of meaning. It tied into ideas about morality. In Christian Europe, darkness of skin was sometimes metaphorically linked to sin, toil, or baseness, while lightness suggested purity, virtue, and divine favor. It was a deeply flawed, but persistent, symbolic association that seeped into art, literature, and everyday judgment. Peasant women, of course, had little chance of conforming to this ideal. Their days were lived under open skies, their complexions freckled and browned by necessity. Yet even here, there might be attempts to soften the effect. Some rubbed their skin with milk or herbal infusions after a day's work to cool and lighten the tone a little. Small acts of resistance against the inevitable. The obsession with pallor also created curious byproducts in fashion. Long sleeves, high necklines, and gloves were not only marks of propriety but also convenient shields from the sun. The less skin exposed, the better preserved its prized fairness. And while this pursuit of a moonlit complexion was a dominant trend, it was not entirely without exceptions. In some Mediterranean courts, a faint blush of natural color, just enough to suggest health, was admired, but even then, it was carefully curated, more the product of rouge than of sunlight. Next, we'll explore what medieval people did once they had achieved this perfect pallor, because no ideal face was complete without the proper frame, and that meant eyebrows, eyelashes, and sometimes removing them entirely. If the pale, unblemished face was the perfect canvas, then the medieval eyebrow was the frame, and frames, like beauty itself, were subject to the whims of fashion in certain periods, particularly in the 14th and 15th centuries. The ideal look involved either thinning the eyebrows to the barest suggestion or removing them entirely. The logic was simple. An unbroken, high, smooth forehead was considered a sign of nobility and intelligence, and if nature had failed to provide you with one, artifice would. Some women plucked their brows until only the faintest line remained, others shaved them off completely, along with the hairline at the top of the forehead. In order to create more space between the eyes and hair, this lengthened the face, giving it the serene, open look that painters adored. It's the same aesthetic that makes so many portraits of medieval noblewomen look faintly alien to our eyes. The removal process was rarely pleasant. Tweezers were the most common tool, though threads or even sharpened clamshells could be used for plucking. Ointments made from quicklime or arsenic were applied to thin, stubborn hair quickly, though at the cost of chemical burns and sometimes permanent scarring. Discomfort, however, was no deterrent when beauty and social standing were at stake. Men were not entirely immune to the trend, though they did not go so far as shaving their brows away. Some noblemen had them thinned to avoid a coarse appearance. This was, after all, an era in which refinement was expressed as much through physical presentation as through manners or speech. Once the brow was removed or minimized, makeup took over. Some women darkened the faint line that remained with soot, ground antimony, or crushed berries. The aim was not the bold, sharply defined arches of today, but a delicate shadow that suggested form without overpowering the face. Eyelashes, too, were subject to modification in certain circles. Long, curling lashes were praised for their doe-eyed softness. In others, they were considered distracting and were shortened to draw more attention to the forehead and eyes. Medieval beauty was nothing if not inconsistent in its decrees. These choices were also deeply symbolic in an age obsessed with the language of the body. A high, bare forehead was more than a quirk of style. It was a physical declaration of moral and intellectual superiority. The smooth expanse of skin suggested a life untroubled by manual labor or coarse concerns. But there's a certain irony here. For all the effort spent removing hair and reshaping the face, the goal was not to draw attention but to create the illusion of natural, effortless perfection, a perfection that, of course, required endless, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous maintenance. Next, we'll move a little lower on the face, because no matter how wide and noble your forehead, the medieval mouth had its own strict rules, and they were often dictated less by romance than by hygiene and superstition. If the medieval forehead was a carefully curated blank canvas, the mouth was the signature, one that could be charming, desirable, or deeply off-putting depending on your luck, your diet, and your access to rudimentary dentistry. Ideally, lips were small, neat, and lightly tinted, a delicate rose shade, not the bold crimson of later centuries, but the softer flush of youth and health. This tint could be achieved naturally, if you happen to be in your teens, and well-fed, or artificially, with a dab of crushed red roots, berries, or cochineal mixed with animal fat. Wealthy women sometimes used imported saffron or Brazil wood shavings, giving their lips a rare golden red hue. Teeth, however, were an entirely different matter. Medieval Europe was not awash in refined sugar until the late Middle Ages, which meant tooth decay was less rampant than in the centuries that followed. But poor dental care still ensured that many mouths fell short of the poetic ideal. Medieval literature is full of references to white as milk teeth, yet this was more aspiration than reality. Many people's teeth were yellowed from age, stained from ale, wine, or herbs, and uneven thanks to rough diets and lack of orthodontics. For those who could afford it, there were whitening attempts. Chalk powder, crushed pumice, and even salt rubbed on with a cloth could brighten the smile, temporarily, and at the cost of enamel. Some remedies went further, using mixtures of vinegar and alum to strip stains, though they often left the gums inflamed and teeth sensitive. Breath was another silent player in the beauty game. No one wrote love poems about halitosis, though the cause, poor dental hygiene, rotting teeth, and rich diets heavy on onions and garlic, was a common reality among peasants and nobility alike. To combat this, people chewed aromatic herbs like parsley, fennel, or mint. The wealthiest might sweeten their breath with imported cloves or cinnamon, a luxury that doubled as a display of status. Lip shape also carried cultural weight. While plump, rounded lips were associated with warmth and sensuality, overly full lips could be painted as signs of lust or moral weakness in certain moralistic writings. Thin lips, conversely, were praised as a sign of restraint and refinement, especially for women. For men, the ideal mouth was clean-shaven, the lips unhidden by unruly mustaches or beards. This was less about aesthetic preference and more about class. Beards were associated with warriors, laborers, or older men, The youthful, courtly man was smooth-faced, his lips visible and expressive for courtly conversation or poetic recitation. Perhaps the strangest part of the medieval mouth's beauty standards was the balance between attraction and modesty. Lips were painted, shaped, and softened, but they were rarely shown in public in intimate ways. Public kissing was not a casual greeting in most contexts. It was formal, ritualized, and bound by etiquette. Beauty, in this case, was designed to be admired from a polite distance, not displayed in unrestrained affection. And so, in the quiet glow of a medieval chamber, a lady might apply her berry tint with a small bronze mirror, adjust the curve of her smile, and step into a hall where her lips would remain pressed into courteous stillness for hours on end, another piece of art in a gallery of restraint. Next, we'll turn our attention to a part of the face that medieval painters adored almost obsessively: the eyes. Not just their color, but the strange, sometimes alarming things people did to make them beautiful. If medieval poets could be trusted, the eyes were the seat of the soul, the windows through which love, longing, and moral worth could all be measured. And yet, like every other natural feature, they were also subject to the quiet tyranny of fashion and artifice. The preferred medieval eye was large, almond-shaped, and bright, not merely in color, but in literal shine. The gaze was meant to look clear, moist, and lively, as though constantly on the verge of poetic tears. To achieve this, some women used a questionable trick: a tiny drop of belladonna juice in the eye. Belladonna, meaning beautiful lady, dilated the pupils, giving the eyes a dark, glistening look, but it also blurred vision and, with repeated use, could cause blindness. The price of allure was, quite literally, the dimming of sight. Color carried its own hierarchy. Light eyes, blue, gray, or green, were romanticized in countless verses, associated with purity, mystery, and otherworldly beauty. Dark brown eyes, though common, were still admired, but often linked to earthiness, sensuality, or foreign allure. The church, as always, had its opinions. Certain sermons warned that overly direct or inviting glances were tools of temptation, a reminder that the wrong kind of beautiful eyes could lead to sin. Cosmetic enhancement was not entirely absent. Some medieval beauty recipes recommended washing the eyes with mixtures of fennel water or rose water, supposedly to brighten them. Others suggested finely ground antimony powder, a dark mineral that could be used to line the eyelids. Much like modern eyeliner, this coal-like substance framed the eyes, deepening their contrast against pale skin and making the whites appear whiter. Eyebrows, too, played a role in the framing of this ideal gaze. Medieval fashion favored thin, arched brows, carefully plucked with small metal tweezers. A high, clean brow line emphasized the forehead's fashionable height, while a slight curve gave the eyes a soft, gentle expression. Overplucked or straight brows, however, could draw whispers, as they were sometimes associated with lower-class grooming habits. Lashes were less discussed in medieval texts. Long, thick lashes would only become a strong beauty symbol centuries later, but a few herbal remedies promised to darken them, usually involving burnt rosemary ash mixed with oil, which could be carefully applied along the lash line with a small stick. This was as much about protecting the eyes from glare and dust as it was about beauty. Eye contact itself was a kind of performance in medieval society. In courtly love traditions, a fleeting glance could carry the weight of a full confession. Lovers often spoke of stealing looks, because lingering too long risked scandal or accusation. Women, especially, were expected to master the art of looking without looking, eyes lowered in modesty, then lifted briefly for a carefully timed spark of connection. In short, the medieval eye was a paradox, meant to reveal the soul, yet often altered to match an ideal, celebrated as a path to intimacy, yet constrained by layers of etiquette and danger. It was not enough to simply see, you had to be seen correctly. And while the poets sang of luminous eyes that inspired ballads, they left out the part where those eyes might be watering from a drop of toxic plant juice or framed by brows aching from hours of plucking. Next, we'll move just a little lower, to the cheeks, where the flush of health was sometimes painted on, powdered over, or entirely faked, depending on your place in the medieval beauty hierarchy. Cheeks, in medieval beauty culture, were tiny landscapes of meaning, part health report, part social status announcement, part silent love letter. A well-colored cheek was a sign of vitality, fertility, and, depending on the shade, a suggestion of moral character. Pale and one meant illness or piety. A healthy blush suggested youth, warmth, and the capacity to bear children. Naturally rosy cheeks were prized not just for their prettiness but for what they implied about the blood flowing beneath the skin. But nature was unreliable, so art stepped in. Medieval cosmetics for cheeks varied wildly by class and region. The simplest was just a brisk rub before stepping into company. Slapping or pinching the cheeks to stimulate temporary redness. The practice was as unglamorous as it sounds, but it worked well enough for a fleeting glow. Those with more resources used herbal and mineral concoctions. One recipe called for mixing crushed red ochre with animal fat. Another favored saffron steeped in milk to create a warmer tint. Some women dusted their cheeks with powdered sandalwood or alkanet root. each giving a reddish hue that could last hours. Perfumers sometimes blended these pigments with rosewater to mask the earthy scent. Among the wealthier classes, lead-based powders tinted with carmine or cinnabar created a more dramatic look. Though these produced vivid, uniform color, they came with the slow, invisible cost of lead poisoning. But beauty rarely stopped for science, especially when science hadn't yet worked out why your face was falling apart. The flush of the cheek also played a role in medieval flirtation. A carefully maintained pink could suggest bashfulness. A modest woman surprised by a gentleman's compliment, but overdone rouge risked accusations of vanity or even immorality. In some moral treatises, artificially reddened cheeks were associated with women of loose virtue, who supposedly painted themselves to lure the unwary into sin. Interestingly, the meaning of cheek color could also shift depending on the broader fashion cycles. In times when extreme pallor was in vogue, a faint blush was enough. When robust, rustic beauty was celebrated, cheeks were expected to bloom like ripe fruit. Poets wrote of apple cheeks and roses in snow, tying beauty to the imagery of gardens and orchards. For peasants, cheek color was less about fashion than environment. Long hours in the wind and sun meant natural weathering. Skin roughened by cold, burned by summer light. Still, even this accidental blush could be romanticized in songs about milkmaids and shepherdesses, where the open-air flush was equated with honesty and vigor. It's worth noting that male beauty ideals also included healthy cheek color. Knights and noblemen returning from hunts or battles were praised for the glow in their faces, the suggestion of strength and vitality. In some courts, a faint flush was even part of the chivalric appearance, healthy enough to fight, gentle enough to court. In paintings and illuminated manuscripts, medieval artists often exaggerated cheek color. In portraits, small crimson dots or circles marked the face. Especially in depictions of the young and beautiful, the effect can look almost cartoonish to modern eyes, but it was part of a visual shorthand for liveliness, much like the halo signified holiness. Cheeks, then, were not just skin. They were little billboards of health, wealth, and desirability. Whether achieved by pinching, pigment, or poison, their color could make or unmake a reputation in the dance of medieval beauty. Next, we'll move. If you've ever seen a medieval portrait and wondered why nobody seems to be smiling, you're not wrong to suspect that it wasn't just a fashion choice. The absence of a grin in oil paint was not some moody artistic flourish. It was, more often than not, a practical act of mercy. The medieval mouth was a place of shadows, ill repair, and questionable odors, and keeping it closed was considered both polite and protective. Teeth, of course, had their own beauty standards. White was desirable, not blinding toothpaste commercial white, but a gentle ivory, the kind you might see in a piece of antique bone china. Unfortunately, achieving and maintaining this look without dentists, floss, or an understanding of bacteria was tricky. Toothpaste, as we know it, didn't exist. Instead, there were powders made of crushed herbs, burnt rosemary, pumice, or, if you were truly desperate, powdered animal bone. Imagine scouring your teeth with something that was both gritty and vaguely smelling of roast lamb. The irony was that the people most able to afford these tooth powders, the wealthy, were also the most at risk of dental decay. Why? Sugar. By the late Middle Ages, imported sugar was a luxury for the rich, used to make elaborate confections, sweetened wines, and candied fruit. These delicacies did wonders for banquets but absolutely ruined teeth. A noble woman might have a velvet gown and a face painted with lead-based powder, but her smile, should she dare to reveal it, might resemble something closer to a weathered picket fence. The poor, on the other hand, rarely touched sugar. Their diets were heavier in coarse bread, pottage, and root vegetables, which, while not glamorous, were less likely to cause cavities. Their teeth might be worn down from years of grinding grain between millstones and chewing hard crusts, but they weren't necessarily rotting. This meant that, paradoxically, a peasant's smile could be more intact than that of a duchess, though of course nobody was going around complimenting peasants on their dental appeal. Dental care, such as it was, involved rudimentary scraping tools, plucking out aching teeth, and rinsing the mouth with vinegar or wine. Some folk remedies suggested rubbing the teeth with sage leaves for a fresh scent. Others believed in spitting into the fire first thing in the morning to prevent toothache for the day, a practice that was equal parts superstition and morning ritual. Missing teeth didn't automatically destroy one's prospects for beauty, though. In some circles, especially among older nobility, it was simply accepted that age would remove certain features. A smile with gaps might even be considered charming, provided it came from someone with enough wealth to distract from the details. Pearls, after all, draw the gaze upward, away from the mouth. Yet beauty standards still valued youth, and youth implied good teeth. Artists often painted sitters with slightly parted lips, just enough to suggest a neat, even row of teeth without having to actually depict them. It was a visual lie, one that viewers were willing to accept, because reality was often far less flattering. There was also an understanding that bad teeth were linked to other unsavory qualities. Rotten teeth suggested a rotten body, or worse, a corrupted soul. The breath that accompanied such teeth could betray gluttony, drunkenness, or moral decay. In this way, the state of your mouth was more than just a cosmetic issue, it was a moral one. A lady who smelled sweetly of cloves was assumed to be virtuous. A man whose breath could kill a chicken at 10 paces, perhaps not so much. And so, the medieval smile was carefully managed. It was rare, small, and fleeting, like a secret not meant for everyone. Lovers might glimpse it in private. Courtiers might see it when a political victory was secured. But it was not, as it is today, a default expression plastered across every portrait and social interaction. The ideal mouth was demure, closed, and modest, more about the promise of beauty than its blatant display. It's worth remembering that the smile itself wasn't yet considered the primary hallmark of beauty. In medieval Europe, beauty resided in the shape of the face, the smoothness of the skin, the arch of the brow. The teeth were secondary, something to be quietly maintained if possible, ignored if not. Of course, this doesn't mean people were entirely indifferent. Recipes for tooth whitening pastes and breath fresheners turn up regularly in medieval household manuscripts, right alongside instructions for removing stains from linen or polishing silver. Beauty was, in many ways, just another form of maintenance, like keeping your hall swept or your armor free from rust. So, when you look at those medieval portraits and see the closed, solemn lips of kings, queens, and nobles, remember, it wasn't just about dignity. Sometimes, dignity was the only thing keeping the mouth shut. When you take all the fragments of medieval beauty standards, the hairlines plucked into submission, the skin powdered into pallor, the brows thinned to a thread, the lips discreet, the waist laced, the eyes modestly downcast, what you end up with is less a living human and more a carefully curated illusion. It is a portrait that exists in both senses of the word, something painted, something posed. To us, in an age of cameras, mirrors, and bright electric light, these standards can seem almost surreal. The medieval idea of beauty was not simply about looking good in the modern sense. It was about looking correct. To be beautiful was to appear in harmony with the ideals of your station, your gender, and your culture. Anything else was a deviation, and deviations were for fools, sinners, or entertainers, and even entertainers had their own rules. There is a strange paradox here. Many of the most prized features were, in truth, signs of fragility. Pale skin hinted that you didn't work outdoors, but it also meant you were more vulnerable to illness. A high, rounded forehead might look graceful in a manuscript illustration, but achieving it through constant hair plucking was painful and could cause infection. The fashionable thin waist wasn't achieved through the steel-boned corsets of later centuries, but through tight girdles, sometimes worn so constantly they caused digestive trouble. Beauty was an art, but an art maintained at a cost. Even so, it would be wrong to imagine everyone in medieval Europe as perpetually obsessed with their reflection. Mirrors were small, expensive, and often distorted, and most people's appearance was something they glimpsed only in fragments. In a polished metal cup, a bucket of water, or, if they were wealthy, a small hand mirror no bigger than a modern saucer. Much of a person's understanding of their own beauty came from how others reacted to them, not from staring at themselves. Compliments and criticisms were mirrors of their own kind. And while these ideals might sound rigid, they were not entirely without flexibility. Beauty shifted with fashion, with region, with the whims of court. In one century, blonde hair was the most coveted shade, to the point where women bleached their locks with harsh lime solutions under the summer sun. In another, darker hair was praised as exotic and alluring. Fashions could change quickly, though quickly in the medieval sense might mean over a few decades, not over a few social media posts. It's also worth noting that while we tend to think of medieval beauty in terms of women, men had their own set of expectations. They were expected to be tall, broad-shouldered, and well-proportioned. A strong jawline and clear skin were considered signs of good breeding and good health. Beards went in and out of style depending on the century. In some periods, a clean-shaven face was the mark of a refined man. In others, a well-groomed beard signified maturity and wisdom. Hair was often worn longer than today, curling to the shoulders, or carefully shaped into a fashionable bowl cut, proof that bad hair decisions are eternal. For both sexes, posture was paramount. Straight backs, graceful movements, and controlled gestures were part of beauty. Slouching was not just lazy, it was ugly. The way you walked, the way you stood, the way you carried your head. These were as important to attractiveness as any physical feature. Beauty was a performance you lived inside every day. Of course, there were those who rejected or simply ignored these ideals. Farmers and craftsmen had little use for high foreheads or delicate hands. Travelers and soldiers valued practical strength over pale skin. In the streets of a medieval city, you could see every variation. The rich painted into elegance, the poor dressed in earth tones, the clergy swathed in black or brown, the occasional troubadour in something loud and impractical. But in the castles, the courts, and the pages of illuminated manuscripts, beauty remained a kind of idealized language. It told people who you were before you spoke. It announced your place in the social hierarchy, could open doors or close them, and like all ideals, it could never be perfectly achieved. That was part of its power. It kept people striving, adjusting, and polishing, long after the point where nature had already made its decisions. In the end, medieval beauty standards were less about nature and more about artifice. They were about creating an image, whether in real life or in paint, that would whisper to the viewer, this person is worthy, this person belongs, this person has the right kind of face. And that image, carefully tended, would live on long after the real person had faded. So when we look back at those faces in tapestries and portraits, the pale skin, the serene expressions, the high foreheads, the careful hair, we are not looking at reality. We are looking at the dream of reality, the polished version that floated through candlelit halls and courtly gardens. Behind it were real people with wrinkles, bad breath, and uneven teeth, just as human as we are. But they knew, as we know now, that beauty is never entirely about the truth. It is about the story you can make someone believe. And with that, our journey through the strange, meticulous, and sometimes absurd world of medieval beauty comes to a close. You can close your eyes now, if you like, and imagine the flicker of torchlight on a jeweled headdress, the rustle of silk, the faint scent of rosemary powder. Somewhere, in a hall far away, someone is still sitting perfectly still, their hairline aching from the plucking, their smile carefully hidden, waiting to be seen.